You're watching This Week in Louisiana Politics with Fred Childers.
Good morning, I'm Fred Childers. Thanks for joining us for This Week in Louisiana Politics on your local election headquarters. We have a great show for you. The race for who will be the next governor of Louisiana now has a Democrat in the running. Former DOTD Secretary Shawn Wilson made it official. Capitol reporter Shannon Hecht caught up with him to hear about his campaign.
Shawn Wilson is the first and only Democrat to get into the gubernatorial race so far, and he says that he's not planning on just being a third term for John Bel Edwards, and that he has a lot of ideas on how he wants to further the state. Wilson served as the DOTD secretary for 7 years, and over his career worked across multiple governors' administrations. He says that experience can help him work with the legislature to get meaningful legislation passed.
And we're going to do it the way I've done my job for the last 25 years. Ignoring the partisanship, working across the line, looking at facts, looking at data, and building sustainable solutions.
Like other candidates, Wilson wants to focus on bettering education, fighting crime, and advancing infrastructure. When asked how he would do this, he initially says technology needs to be better utilized with law enforcement and in schools.
So the idea that we aren't using technology perhaps to deal with that is a concern. We can also use technology to help provide resources for the local governments to be able to network and communicate much more effectively.
Wilson joins an already busy ballot across the aisle with 4 Republicans and 1 independent vying for their seat on the 4th floor. There's still plenty of time for other candidates to get into this race if they want to, as qualifying is not until August. The primary election date is October 14th. For your local election headquarters, I'm Shannon Hecht.
Right out of the gate, Governor John Bel Edwards and Congressman Troy Carter endorsed Wilson for governor. While this is seemingly expected, it shows the Democrats are planning to fall in line behind Wilson right away, rather than let any other big names get in the race. Now, he is still waiting for an official endorsement from his party. Despite pressures from many Republicans and moderates, Congressman Garrett Graves announced he would not be getting into the governor's race. Graves said he could better serve Louisiana in Washington, D.C. He said the governor's race would brighten in the days to come, alluding to another candidate entering the race. Possibly the person Graves was talking about was Stephen Waguespack, who announced he is running for governor as a Republican. Waguespack has been the head of the heavily influential Louisiana Association of Business and Industry. The lobbying group works as a chamber of commerce and advocacy group for businesses and major industries across the state and have a lot of sway at the Capitol. Before that position, Waguespack was a senior advisor to former Governor Bobby Jindal. Now, he had recently hosted a forum questioning the other GOP candidates on the state's biggest issues. According to his letter, that was the final straw in his decision. Attorney General Jeff Landry is heading to Mar-a-Lago to secure an endorsement from former President Donald Trump next month. Landry announced his bid for governor last October. His campaign says a poll they conducted found independents and Republicans in Louisiana would more than likely vote for the candidate who was endorsed by Trump. And we'll talk about that and a lot of other governor-related issues later on in the show. 2 new names have entered the race for Louisiana's treasurer. One is former North Louisiana Congressman John Fleming. Fleming is a conservative who served in the Trump administration. He says he wants to focus the state's investments on banks that he believes will support the state's oil and gas industry. Also entering the race is Democrat Dustin Granger. Granger is a financial advisor from Lake Charles who wants to protect taxpayers from what he calls poor economic decisions.
Now we're seeing a possible elimination of the state income tax, which means to fill that gap, they're going to have to take, or they're going to try to take people's homestead exemption away.
There's going to be added pressure, additional and impending pressure on the treasurer to invest money into left-wing boondoggles where the return is going to be very poor.
Now, the 2 candidates are joining Republican State Representative Scott McKnight in the race to take control of the state's investments. A new issue has come up in the Mayor LaToya Cantrell recall as a media report reveals that an Orleans Parish judge signed that recall petition. Judge Jennifer Medley was the judge who approved to move 25,000 names from active to inactive in the voter rolls, which lowered the threshold of the number of signatures needed for that recall. A legal expert in New Orleans says he expects the petition to get more contentious, and this gives the appearance that Judge Medley is taking sides.
But at a minimum, she should have disclosed that she signed the petition, because she was handling the very case that was a subject matter of the recall. It is clear that she had some interest in the outcome, otherwise she wouldn't have signed the petition.
The expert says without the judge recusing herself, it could get messy, with plenty of grounds for appeals by both sides. We'll keep an eye out on that. Louisiana's Attorney General's office has asked a federal appeals court to formally end a 1992 federal court agreement that led to a black justice being elected to the state's Supreme Court. Assistant Attorney General Elizabeth Murrell told the appellate judges Monday that the agreement isn't needed anymore because black justices have been elected from the New Orleans area in the last 30 years. The Justice Department and voting rights advocates argue the agreement is still needed to ensure black voters have a voice in electing a justice. Now both sides are waiting for a court ruling. Louisiana is working to catch up with the influx of electric and hybrid cars, but lawmakers say they need more time to figure out the best way to tax them in order to cover the cost of road repairs. The state brings in millions of dollars a year from the motor vehicle gas tax. That money is used to pay for infrastructure projects through DOTD. But as electric and hybrid cars use less gas, the state wants to spend more time researching the best way to make up the lost revenue from the gas tax, which has already been declining for years.
We have to make structural changes, and it seems like we must. Let's at least do so in a way that pays for the backlog and structures us to be able to take care of our needs to maintain our roads and bridges.
Louisiana is also faced with an $18 billion backlog in transportation projects. Lawmakers want to find ways to not only replace the lost gas tax revenue, but start chipping away at that backlog. They plan to extend their study task force for another year. Coming up, President Biden's 2023 budget has been released, and Senator Bill Cassidy tells us it's full of giveaways. And First Lady Jill Biden visits the Big Easy. That and more next.
This is your local election headquarters.
Welcome back. A bill that will expand mental health resources to first responders passes the U.S. Senate. The Fighting Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Act, backed by Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, will make sure first responders and 911 personnel have more access to mental health services. The proposed legislation focuses on helping first responders because their jobs can result in long-term mental health effects. The bill now heads to the House for consideration. President Biden's budget for this year was released this week, and there are mixed reviews on what's in it. The White House touted a strong economy and low unemployment, saying this budget will expand on the success of Biden's previous budgets. Republicans, however, point to record inflation and have even mentioned the need for cuts to spending. Senator Bill Cassidy was asked what those cuts would look like. Here's what he had to say.
I'm told that the House budget will come out on Thursday, so they'll specify where their cuts actually are. But I think what the president needs to stop doing is this kind of gratuitous spending. Another example, his student loan bill, $400 billion, up to $1 trillion. And saying that this is the sort of spending that doesn't have to go through Congress.
The budget has an uphill battle in the Republican-controlled House and the Senate, where Democrats hold a thin majority. House Majority Leader Steve Scalise is commenting on the federal government's decision to delay the offshore leasing plan. In a statement, he says in part, quote, "Make no mistake, this announcement of yet another delay in reestablishing American energy dominance is radically extreme and harmful to American families and small businesses that rely on affordable energy. It is an 18-month delay on the 5-year offshore leasing plan. Nearly 15% of America's domestic oil and natural gas is produced offshore. A majority of that is off of Louisiana's coast." First Lady Jill Biden visited Louisiana this week. She traveled to New Orleans as part of the Biden administration's Cancer Moonshot Initiative, which looks to cut cancer-related deaths by 50% over the next 25 years. The initiative encourages people across the medical field to work together to not only find ways to cure cancer, but address the barriers to early detection. Coming up, we've seen some major developments in the race for governor recently. Up next, we'll talk to a pollster about who's in, who's out, and why it matters. Stay with us.
This is your local election headquarters.
Welcome back to This Week in Louisiana Politics. We're going to spend the next several minutes talking about the governor's race. Joining me now is John Couvillon with JMC Analytics and Polling. He's our pollster that we go to a lot to talk about some of these things. Welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on, John.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
So let's focus on the first. Let's focus on the latest developments in the governor's race. First, we have Stephen Waguespack entering the race, and we have U.S. Congressman Garrett Graves announcing that he won't enter the race after hinting that he might. So let's take the Stephen Waguespack focus first. How does that impact the governor's race?
A lot. And the reason I'm saying a lot is you have to appreciate that when we're talking about the governor's race, there's 3 swim lanes you have to talk about, because each swim lane represents a constituency that'll get you into the runoff. So what happened with Stephen Waguespack / Garrett Graves is there is what I would call the moderate Republican swim lane, which is really what I would think of more business-friendly type of Republicans who are more interested in economic type issues as opposed to culture war issues. And these Republicans tend to live in the more populous parishes in southeastern Louisiana, like in the Baton Rouge and New Orleans media markets. So these business-friendly Republicans basically have been looking for a candidate. Garrett Graves could have fit the bill in terms of being a viable candidate for voters in that ideological swim lane. But when he decided against running at about the same time that Stephen Waguespack decided to run, that type of voter now had a candidate to support. Now, the reason I'm making such a confident declaration about Stephen Waguespack is for 2 reasons. Number one, he's the head of the state's main business organization, which is the Louisiana Association of Business and Industry. That gives him access to big dollar donors to give him the necessary funding to run a credible race. Because it's one thing to have a constituency that's looking for a candidate, but you have to find a way to reach that constituency. That, of course, takes money. So that's part number one as to why I think that Stephen Waguespack would be a formidable candidate. Part number 2 is that coming from the Baton Rouge area and talking about economic issues, again, he's addressing the issues that are important to this group of voters. And by the way, enough of these voters who normally vote Republican defected to Governor Edwards both in 2015 and 2019 to elect him. So there's certainly a block of voters in places like East Baton Rouge and St. Tammany and Jefferson parishes that can't be ignored. So all of that taken together is what makes the Wagaspack entry substantial, in my opinion.
If you ask him, AG Jeff Landry will tell you that he's the heavy hitter in this race. In fact, I think he has alluded to a poll saying that he's in the lead and he's the front runner. Have you seen any research that would indicate that that's the case?
So there's two parts to your question, which is a very interesting question. At the present time, I would say yes, he is a heavy hitter because he has a well-defined constituency. And he has ample funding. I mean, we're talking about $5 million cash on hand, plus another $1 million if we're talking about affiliated PACs. What Jeff Landry's challenge is, if he wants to be a guaranteed runoff contender, is he certainly attracts the affection of the more ideological wing of the Republican Party, which I call the quote-unquote conservative swim lane. That swim lane is not in itself enough to win with 51% of the vote. So you run the real risk of, if you pay attention to that group of voters to the exclusion of more business-friendly Republicans, you could win the battle and lose the war, which is what happened with David Vitter in 2015 and Eddie Risponi in 2019.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. Back in 2015, we saw Vitter had more money, I believe, than John Bel Edwards, but of course Edwards went on to become the governor. So in these early days of the race, how much does, you mentioned that Landry has about $5 million. I think Schroeder has quite a bit too, close to $3 million, I believe, at last check. How big of a role is this money going to play in the early days of the race?
Critical, and in fact it's critical in two ways. Number one, having enough money to get your name out to voters, and number two, being able to hold on to enough money to have a credible campaign in the summer and fall when voters are paying attention. So you're kind of facing two kinds of gravitational pulls with those challenges, which is, you want to get your name out there now, but of course that takes money. And if you spend too much money, the till will be empty in the fall. But at the same time, you do have to invest some money to start getting voters aware of who you are. But if you do it too soon, voters aren't really tuned into the governor's race in March. Right now is what I call the donor primary, which is when all the donors and political observers and so forth are really paying more attention than the average voter is.
We have to talk about the Trump effect as well. I believe Landry is going to go kiss the ring and get that endorsement. How much will that help?
I see it for Jeff Landry as neither helps nor hurts. And the reason being is there is an almost perfect correlation between the Republicans in that more ideological swim lane and those who would have a considerable amount of affection for former President Trump. In other words, Jeff Landry is getting the support here. Jeff Landry's support from President Trump is basically coming from voters who already are supporting him anyway. So it's not like it's pulling in new voters. And President Trump, while he does poll strongly in Louisiana, I am seeing softening of his numbers in terms of, when I ask the question if you're more or less likely to support a candidate endorsed by President Trump, the numbers in my polls are showing that it would certainly be enough of a constituency to help you make the runoff, but perhaps not enough to win the general election.
John, so we have a slew of Republicans in this race. We have one Democrat so far, Wilson.
Correct.
And I'm just curious, I know we have a long way to go before the election, but do you believe that he could stay the lone Democrat in this race and have all the Democrats coalesce around him?
I agree with the second part of your statement, with the Democrats coalesce behind him, because basically what's happening is this. Technically, you can have Democrats jumping in between now and qualifying, and in fact, I would expect more Democrats to jump in. The crucial distinction here between the first and second part of your question is, will that Democrat jumping in be of any kind of substantial nature? In other words, somebody who barely has enough money to pay the qualifying fee, as opposed to somebody who could come up with a couple $1 million pretty quickly. And the reason I'm bringing that distinction up is this. In recent days, Governor Edwards' organization has made it clear that they support Shawn Wilson for governor. When you have an incumbent governor telling the world that you support this person, that's a very strong signal to Democrats that if you're contemplating running, you're certainly not going to have air cover from the governor and probably are not going to have any kind of support from donors. So I see Shawn Wilson as an almost guaranteed lock for one of the runoff spots, because you do have enough Democrats in this state to where that constituency alone from an endorsed candidate will get you into the runoff.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there. I think the race is going to be very interesting. We know you're going to keep an eye on it, as will we.
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming on. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
This is your local election headquarters.
All right, getting you ready for the week ahead. On Monday, Commissioner of Administration Jay Darden will be talking about the budget process to the Baton Rouge Press Club. On Wednesday, Joint Agriculture will meet at the Capitol to talk about support for LSU and Southern programs. Thursday, the Water Sector Commission will talk about project funding at the Capitol. Thank you for joining us for This Week in Louisiana Politics. I'm Fred Childers. Stay informed, and I'll see you next Sunday right here on your local election headquarters.